Over the years, I've spent countless hours studying atheism, engaging with its arguments, and giving it the benefit of the doubt. But recently, I made an announcement. After over a decade of exploring atheism, I no longer take it seriously. And apparently, that statement triggered everybody, like atheists, Christians, you name it. People couldn't help but chime in. Well, today I'm going to put my cards on the table. I'm going to break down exactly why I think atheism is, quite frankly, a pretty silly view. And if your reasoning looks anything like mine, I think you'll see why you shouldn't take it seriously either. Real quick, forgive me, I'm a little bit sick right now, so if I sound congested, just bear with me. All right, so here's what makes this video unique, okay? I'm not just gonna talk at you about philosophy. I wanna bring math to the table. So using probability theory and some awesome, amazing new software that I built over Christmas. Yes, I code on my holidays. I'll visually demonstrate why atheism is non-serious. And don't worry, you don't need a PhD in math to follow along with this video. The software is going to make it super easy to follow, and I promise it's actually going to blow your mind. Like, this video has the potential to skyrocket your level of credence in the existence of God. Before we dive into the good stuff of this video, let me just quickly recap the main point of my last video, because some folks unsurprisingly misunderstood what my point was. Here's what I said. Okay, even if we grant atheism's so-called best argument, the problem of evil, it still does not prove atheism is true. At best, it might challenge the idea that the creator is all-powerful or morally perfect, but it doesn't establish that the creator doesn't exist. Now, let me clear up another big misconception. When I say I no longer take atheism seriously, what I mean is that I no longer take it as a serious contender to theism. Some people think that the problem of evil makes atheism more likely than theism, or that it's some kind of like theism-destroying trump card. But let me be blunt. That is obviously false. The existence of evil doesn't magically make atheism the most reasonable explanation of reality. So in this video, I'm going to show you step by step why that's the case, but you got to stick around to the end to see it all sort of laid out, all the reasoning. So if you've ever heard the problem of evil touted as this like ultimate argument for atheism, stick around. You're about to see a beautiful visual refutation of that claim. So here's what's coming up. I'm going to walk you through some of the strongest evidence for theism, and we're going to assign probabilities to that evidence. But don't worry, it's going to be all visual. It's going to be beautiful. It's going to be super easy to follow. No math degree required. Then once we've got a sort of rough idea of how likely theism is based on the evidence, we're going to flip the script and look at atheism's best shot, the problem of evil. Spoiler alert, it's not going to do what atheists think it does. Even if we give it way more credit than it deserves, it's still not going to establish atheism as the most likely explanation of reality. And just as a quick heads up, I've got a longer live stream planned where we'll take a deeper dive into even more evidence for theism. I'll be teaming up with experts like Luke Barnes and Robin Collins. Trust me, it's going to be well worth your time. More on that later, though. Let's get to the good stuff. All right, let me introduce you to the star of today's show, my brand new, beautiful new software. Here it is. Dun, 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 dun. Boom. There it is. Dynamic Bayesian bar chart. That's just, I don't really have a name for it yet, but this little creation of mine, I think, is going to blow some minds. But before we jump into the first piece of evidence for theism, we need to lay a little bit of groundwork. So in this video, we'll be comparing three different hypotheses. One, perfect being theism, the idea that a perfect being exists with all of the omnis, omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence. Two, a limited theism. This covers any view where some sort of deity exists but is not perfect. So it's basically like the non-perfect being theism version of theism. And then third, the third hypothesis is the view, atheism is the view that there are no gods at all. To keep things as simple and as easy as possible for the audience, we're going to start with equal prior probabilities, 50% for atheism, 50% for theism. Then we're going to split theism evenly between perfect being theism and limited theism, giving each a starting point of 25%. So let's go ahead and plug this into my software now. All right, first thing we got to do is label perfect being theism, PBT, PBT. All right, our next proposition, and we're going to give that one a starting percentage of 25%. Next one is limited theism. We'll call this LT. Again, 25%. And then the last one, atheism, A, and we'll give it a probability of 0.5. There you go. So in case you don't know, prior probabilities are just like our starting probabilities before we look at the evidence. So don't stress if you think that these numbers should be tweaked at all. Tweaking the priors is not really going to change the final result, the final conclusion that I'm going to reach in this video. And for any of you sort of nerds out there watching, this is not an endorsement of a naive principle of indifference. All right, with that initial setup out of the way, here are the three pieces of evidence for theism we're going to cover in this video. So number one, the universe is orderly. Number 2, the universe is fine-tuned for life. Number 3, there is consciousness. After we work through these 3 pieces of evidence for theism, then we'll introduce the problem of evil, the argument that atheists love to bring up, and we'll see how it impacts the overall situation. All right, let's start with our first piece of evidence, order. When I talk about order, what I mean is that all objects in the universe are subject to the same laws everywhere and at all times. So no matter where you are, if you're on Earth, the edge of the galaxy, or the farthest reaches of the universe. So for example, if you're in the Star Wars universe, part of the galaxy, everything behaves in exactly the same way, with the same powers and the same liabilities. So gravity pulls with the same force, light travels at the same speed no matter where you are in the universe, and electrons all have the same charge. It's like every clock in the universe is perfectly synchronized, ticking away in harmony without any communication between them. This universal consistency throughout the universe is actually astonishing. It's not exactly something that we would just expect to find by chance. So why does everything follow the same rules? Why do those rules apply everywhere and at all times? Science, for all its magnificent power, doesn't answer this question. It doesn't answer it at all. Science assumes that the laws exist and it uses them as sort of like a foundation for what it does. But it doesn't explain, science does not explain why these laws exist or why they're so consistent throughout the entire universe. All right, back to my software. All right, so here's where my software comes to sort of map this out visually. All right, think of each hypothesis, perfect being theism, limited theism, LT, and atheism, A, as a big sheet of paper. All right, we're gonna assume that we're dealing with pieces of paper. All right, we're going back to elementary school. So each sheet represents the possibility space for that hypothesis. I've also got that represented in bars on the screen. Okay, so this pink area is atheism, the yellow area, limited theism, blue area, perfect being theism. The possibility space refers to everything that's possible if that hypothesis is true. These sheets, imagine that these are sheets, are sized according to their starting probabilities, okay? 25% for perfect being theism, we've got that here, 25% for limited theism, and then 50% for atheism, right? That's where we started. When we add the evidence of order, which we're about to do, the software acts almost like a pair of scissors, cutting away sections, like large sections in some cases, of each sheet that don't fit the evidence. The possibility space that doesn't fit the evidence is cut away. After this, it resizes the remaining pieces to add up to 100% again. We're going to see what that looks like visually as well. But this is how we calculate updated probabilities for each hypothesis based on new pieces of evidence. So if you weren't following that, pay attention to this next section. It's really going to help you. And again, we're going to see it visually. So just stick with me. All right, so first let's go ahead and add our first piece of evidence. This one is going to be labeled order. I'm going to explain what's going on the screen in a second. But first, what we got to do is evaluate the likelihood of the evidence given the various hypotheses. Okay, so here's how the evidence affects the probabilities in this case. So under perfect being theism, that's our first probability we need to assign. Order actually makes a lot of sense. Okay, a perfect being would value rationality, consistency, and beauty, all of which are reflected in universal laws. So order allows, for example, for a stable, predictable universe, a framework where life, creativity, and moral growth can flourish. So it's pretty plausible that a perfect being would actually create a universe with consistent order. So let's conservatively, though, let's be conservative here. We didn't want to assign too much of a probability here. Let's assign something like 50%. Okay, it's 50% likely, 0.5, that a perfect being would create an orderly universe. In this case, what you're seeing is that half of perfect being theism's sheet is being cut. Okay, this lighter area here, imagine that sheet, that part of perfect being theism's sheet is being cut away, okay? So we're basically saying that at least half of the possibility space on perfect being theism contains order. Half of it contains disorder. That's what this 0.5 or 50% probability sort of represents. All right, let's move on to limited theism. So limited theism could also explain order, but here's the problem with limited theism. Creating a universe where every object follows the same laws everywhere and at all times is actually a really big deal. Like it seems kind of difficult. A limited deity might lack the power, they might lack the knowledge, or even the motivation to achieve such perfect consistency throughout the universe. So while order is definitely possible under limited theism, it's far less likely than it is under perfect being theism. So again, we're going to be conservative. Let's assign this a probability of 10%. So 0.1, and let's see what happens. All right. So basically, in this case, most of limited theism's sheet is being cut away here. Okay, this is the removed portion of limited theism that we're seeing what happens when we add the evidence of order. This piece is being cut away, and this is all that's left down here of limited theism. All right, let's now turn to atheism. So under atheism, why would we expect every particle in the universe to behave in exactly the same way at all times and in all places? Why not just pure chaos? Some atheistic scenarios might even allow for order, but these are very rare exceptions. Most atheistic universes would look completely chaotic, with objects behaving unpredictably or following, and here's a key point here, they might be just following local, inconsistent rules, right? You don't have to have rules that are consistent throughout the universe. You could have local patches of order. So, but let's be generous again and assign the probability of order under atheism at 1 in 1,000 or 0.1%. So let's go ahead and do that now. 0.001. Enter. So in this case, the evidence cuts almost all of atheism's sheet, leaving just a tiny little corner. And actually we can zoom in here and we can see what's going on. Okay, so this is all that's left here. 0.00005% of the entire possibility space is left over. So when we plug these numbers into the software, here's basically what happens. Okay, perfect being theism sheet retains a significant portion of its space, growing in relative size to the others. Limited theism sheet shrinks, but it's still sort of in the running, all right? But then atheism sheet, just with one piece of evidence, is almost entirely cut away, leaving a fraction of its starting probability. So after normalization, that's what this last bar is on the graph here, normalized priors. That's where what's left over after we've cut away the different, possibility space, the different sheets of paper, what's left over is then sort of stretched out. It's stretched out over, a probability of 1. Okay. And so the leftover probabilities are just sort of stretched out so you can see them. And when we zoom back in here, you can actually see that while atheism is still is very unlikely at this point after just one piece of evidence, it's still there, right? We can still at least see it. So here's what happens to our final probabilities after we have done just included one piece of evidence. All right, perfect being theism is now sitting at 83%. Limited theism is now sitting at 16 or 17%, and atheism is like 0.3%. But this step-by-step filtering and rescaling process is actually what makes this software so powerful. It's something I'm so proud of it. I can't tell you guys enough. But it lets you see how the evidence is actually shaping the plausibility of each hypothesis after we add in that evidence. And it's also operating 100% using Bayes' theorem, so you can actually take the calculations in the software to the bank. But real quick, let me address one possible objection in this section, okay? Some atheists might argue that there are possible atheistic scenarios that predict order, like a multiverse or some kind of like self-organizing principle in nature. And that's totally fair enough. But here's my response to that. Just because there are scenarios that are possible under atheism, that doesn't make them likely under atheism. So under atheism, these scenarios occupy only a tiny sliver of the overall possibility space. The vast majority of atheistic possibilities, on that sheet of paper predict disorder, are comprised of disorder and chaos, not the stunning universal regularity that we observe in this universe where the laws are universal, they're not local, they're throughout the whole universe. So even if we grant that such scenarios are possible under atheism, where there are possible sort of possibilities under atheism where there is order, that doesn't change the fact that order is overwhelmingly improbable on atheism or given atheism or under atheism. That's why the numbers that we've assigned here, where atheism accounts for less than 1%, still holds up. And remember, this is just one piece of evidence. Okay, we haven't even gotten to like the big daddy, all right? Now let's see what happens when we add in the next piece of evidence. Let's move on to fine-tuning. First, what do we mean by fine-tuning? Well, it's the idea that the fundamental constants of nature, the numbers baked into the laws of physics, so even if you've got laws, if you've got universal regularity, these are the constants of nature, the numbers that are in there. And these numbers fall within an extraordinarily narrow range that makes life possible. So for example, gravity is strong enough to hold planets together, but it's not so strong that stars are going to collapse in on themselves, right? You've got the right number in that gravitational constant. The same goes for countless other constants like the cosmological constant, which governs the expansion of the universe. And here's what's important here, though. The numbers that we see in these constants, they didn't have to fall into life-permitting ranges. And in fact, they're so precise that changing just one constant by even a fraction could render the entire universe lifeless. Let's quantify this with an example. Dr. Luke Barnes, a cosmologist, has calculated that the odds of getting the right value for the cosmological constant are 1 in 10 to the 90th. 1 in 10 to the 90th. I don't know why I'm doing this. That's a decimal. Okay, if you don't know the math here, that's a decimal followed by 90 zeros before you hit a 1. To put that into perspective, that would be like basically randomly picking one specific atom out of the entire observable universe and somehow picking the right one. That's the probability that we're talking about here by chance. Okay, and according to Barnes, when you combine all of the known fine-tuned constants, the odds drop to, here it is, 1 in 10 to the 136. At this point, these sorts of numbers are so small, it's almost impossible to imagine. All right, let's go ahead and add fine-tuning as another piece of evidence. So let's add it here. We'll write it in fine-tuning. All right, so now we're ready to evaluate under our different hypotheses. So first of all, perfect being theism. A perfect being wouldn't necessarily have to create a life-permitting orderly universe. He could create something else like an orderly realm filled with angels. But it's pretty plausible that a perfect being might value a universe capable of sustaining life as a sort of consequence of his laws, maybe as a reflection of his creativity and his goodness. But let's be, again, conservative and assign this a relatively low probability of 1 in 1,000, or again, 0.1%. And so in this case, most of perfect being theism's sheet is being cut away, 0.001. All right. Next, limited theism. So a limited deity might lack the power to fine-tune a universe to this degree. All right, he just might not have enough power. Or he might have that power and just not value it as much as an even greater genius might value it. It's far less likely that a being with limited abilities could or would produce a life-permitting universe, but still it's not fantastically implausible. We're limited beings and we fine-tune things all the time when we have a chance. So let's set this probability at 1 in 1 million. All right, we're going to go with a relatively low number here. So 1 in 1 million, let's type that in. 0.0000001. Okay, so atheism is looking pretty good here until we start talking about how likely fine-tuning is on atheism. All right, so here's where things get ridiculous. All right, on atheism, there is no guiding intelligence. It's all pure dumb luck. All right, the odds of hitting a life-permitting universe by chance are astronomical. We've already talked about it, but let's be very generous to the atheists. There's a point why I'm doing this actually, because it's going to break my software if I actually put in the right numbers. But let's be generous and say that it's 1 in a trillion, or 1 in 10 to the 12th power. All right, so even though that's wildly optimistic compared to the real number that Luke Barnes has calculated, let's go ahead and plug that in here. So 0.0000000000001. See what happens. Ooh, okay. So when we plug these numbers into the software, it rules out nearly all of atheism's possibility space and a significant chunk of limited theism's space. And what's left is that perfect being theism comes out way ahead. You know what? Let's go ahead and just zoom in here, see if we can even see the possibility space or the probability of atheism. Let's just try to zoom in, see if we can even see this. And we got to zoom in a lot. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Oh, there it is. There's atheism. We had to zoom in a lot, but we see it. You know, my software is even just registering it as like a 0 probability at this point, but it's not completely 0, okay? Actually, if we look here, we should be able to see the final probabilities, the final posterior probabilities here. Okay, so it's using scientific notation, so it's non-zero, guys. Atheism is still, you know, it's still there. There's still a chance that atheism is true. So it's not completely out of the running. So that's good. So after fine tuning, the updated probabilities look like this. So perfect being theism, my software is rounding it up to 1. Limited theism is, sort of a tiny fraction, and atheism is virtually non-existent. And here's the wild part, guys. Okay, this isn't even using the real fine-tuning numbers like 1 in 10 to the 136. If we use the real numbers, atheism slice would disappear almost entirely. Again, it wouldn't be 0, but it would be very, 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 very low. You wouldn't even see it on the graph. Like, it would break my software. All right, let's now add one more crucial clue to the mix. Before we get to the problem of evil, let's turn now to consciousness. So for clarity, when I say consciousness, I'm specifically talking about conscious creatures, created beings that have mental states, beings like us who can think and feel and reflect on the world around us. Here's the question though. Given the orderly and fine-tuned universe we've already established as background knowledge, how likely is it that conscious creatures would exist under each of our 3 hypotheses? Let's go back to my software and add in our third piece of evidence. This one is, again, consciousness. We'll type it out really quickly. All right, so starting with perfect being theism, if a perfect being exists, it wouldn't be too surprising to find that this being has created conscious creatures. Why? Well, first of all, a perfect being would recognize the intrinsic value of consciousness. Consciousness is pretty valuable. Consciousness enables rational thought. It enables love, creativity, moral understanding, and good, deep relationships, all of which align with a perfect creator's values. Since we've already established an orderly, fine-tuned universe in our background knowledge, the existence of conscious creatures fits really naturally, actually, on a perfect being hypothesis. But let's conservatively assign this a probability of 50%, so 0.5. Let's see what happens. Let's turn now to limited theism. All right, so under limited theism, a conscious deity might also value creating conscious creatures. After all, relationships with other conscious beings are highly meaningful, and even we as limited beings create conscious creatures all the time when we have, humans create families and stuff. But consciousness is also incredibly complex and difficult to explain. If you've ever thought about it for any amount of time, a limited deity might lack the power or understanding to create consciousness, even in an orderly, fine-tuned universe. While many conceivable limited beings could potentially create consciousness, the challenge of consciousness makes this significantly less likely than under perfect being theism. So let's assign this a probability of just 1% or 0.01. Now, under atheism, consciousness is wildly unexpected. I can't sugarcoat this at all. In a universe that's already orderly and fine-tuned, life itself is still a staggering rarity, okay? The odds of randomly assembling the right conditions for even the simplest forms of life are astronomically low. But even if life somehow emerges on atheism, this leap to consciousness is an entirely different level of improbability. Consciousness introduces something radically new, subjective experience, unlike physical properties like mass or charge, which are publicly accessible and measurable. Consciousness gives its subject privileged access to mental states. So for example, only you know that you're in pain. Your awareness of it is fundamentally different from any external observation. This sudden emergence of a property so unlike everything else in a physical universe is deeply puzzling under atheism. Why would blind, unguided processes produce beings capable of self-awareness, rational thought, and moral understanding? In a godless universe, consciousness isn't just a fluke, it's a fluke of a fluke, layered on top of the already improbable emergence of life. Even being generous, the probability of consciousness arising under atheism is vanishingly small. But let's set it at 1 in a million. All right, let's be generous here. So 0.000001. So after we plug these numbers into the software, perfect being theism retains a significant portion. Limited theism loses most of its space again. But after, let's just look at the probabilities, okay? So again, it's sort of rounding up to 1 for perfect being theism. Limited theism, barely there. Atheism, man, it's sad. It's very sad. All right, we've covered order, fine-tuning, and consciousness, evidence that overwhelmingly tips the scales toward theism. Now let's tackle atheism's best argument, the problem of evil. The argument basically goes like this: if a perfect God exists, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? Some atheists claim that this is like a knockout punch, the ultimate defeater for belief in God. But here's the thing, it's not as strong as it seems on the surface, and I'm about to show you why. All right, we are ready to add our fourth piece of evidence, evil. Let's go ahead and scroll down here, type in evil. There we go. All right, we're ready to assign our value, our first value. So let's start with perfect being theism. If God exists, why would he allow evil? One plausible answer, one answer that I find really plausible, is what philosophers call the soul-building theodicy. The idea here is that challenges, suffering, and even tragedy can serve a purpose. They shape us into better, stronger, and more virtuous beings. Think of it like going to the gym, right? There's no pain, no gain. Moreover, there are a lot of great goods that can't exist without evil: courage, self-sacrificial love, and the like. A good being might judge that those greater goods should exist to at least a degree, but then he'd need to permit evil. There's also been some really intelligent extensions of this theodicy to cover animal suffering. Now, does this mean that evil is sort of guaranteed under perfect being theism if we have a theodicy like this? I don't necessarily think so, but it's also not wildly unexpected either. So let's assign the likelihood of observing evil under perfect being theism a conservative 10% or 0.1. As you can see here, a lot of the possibility space is being cut away on theism here. All right, so what about limited theism? A limited deity might not have the power to prevent evil, or they might just not care enough to try, or he might, like lots of people, be on the whole very good, but sometimes falls short. Or maybe he just can't see the future, so he can't stop all the evil. There's a lot of possibilities here. Evil under this hypothesis is therefore plausible, but it's not guaranteed. So let's set this probability at 50%, 0.5. Now for atheism. Some might think that evil is sort of like a given under atheism. After all, why wouldn't there be suffering in a godless universe with conscious creatures? But let's again be generous to the atheist and set this probability at 1 or 100%. We'll just assume that if atheism is true, evil and suffering is an absolute given. When we plug these numbers, these probabilities into the software, here's what happens. All right. Perfect being theism, still overwhelmingly dominant. Limited theism, still pretty tiny. Atheism, still barely clinging to relevance. Like you literally need scientific notation to even understand how improbable atheism is. But let's raise the stakes. Let's grant the atheist their best case scenario. Let's say the problem of evil is so powerful that the probability of observing evil under perfect being theism drops to 1 in 100,000. So we'll adjust this number, 0.000001. All right, so what happens in this scenario? As you can see, in this unlikely scenario, the odds now slightly favor perfect being theism over limited theism. So we've got a final probability of perfect being theism is about 83%, limited theism about 16%, and then atheism is, again, virtually non-existent. But maybe you're not convinced. Maybe you think the problem of evil has way more force than even that. So let's get super dumb and let's assign the probability of 1 in a trillion just to see what happens. 0.0000000000001. So as you can see, in this scenario, all we've done is basically rule out perfect being theism and atheism. So look what happened to limited theism. The software is now rounding up to 1 or 100%, pretty much. In other words, theism still wins by a long shot. So here's the point of all this. The problem of evil isn't the theism destroying argument it's often made out to be. At most, it might challenge the idea of a perfect God, but it doesn't make atheism more plausible or more probable than theism. And in fact, it leaves atheism basically exactly where it started, a long shot. And don't forget, we didn't even use the real numbers for fine-tuning. If we had, atheism's chance of survival wouldn't just be slim, it would be microscopic. Like you'd need to use a microscope in the software just to hope to find it. But here's the thing, okay? I don't think theists are backed into a corner that they have to embrace limited theism. In fact, I firmly believe that the problem of evil has very strong answers. I've already mentioned the soul-building theodicy. Perfect being theism, I think, remains the best option on the table. But even in the absolute worst case scenario, the right move isn't to jump ship to atheism, it's to consider limited theism. Having said all of this, if you're still taking atheism as a serious hypothesis about reality, maybe it's time to start asking why. If you want to dive even deeper into why belief in God isn't just reasonable, it's the best explanation for reality, then click on this video right here. Go ahead and click on it, because I'm just going to be waiting here awkwardly until you do. Mm.